The dust was a living thing, a fine red ghost that coated the tongue and turned the throat to sandpaper. It rose in lazy plumes from the woman's dragging feet, bare and blistered, each step a small, silent scream against the baked earth. Beside her, 2 children, no older than 7, walked with the grim, unblinking focus of old soldiers. Their faces were small, serious triangles of bone and sun-scorched skin, their eyes vast and dark with a knowledge no child should possess. The boy's hand was a permanent fixture in the faded calico of his mother's skirt, a tiny anchor in a merciless sea of sun and sky. The girl walked on her other side, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she could will a destination into existence through sheer force of will. They had been walking for days, propelled by a fear that had long since burned through their grief. The woman, Mary, swayed with a rhythm that was not of walking but of falling and catching herself, over and over. A dry, rattling cough tore from her chest, a sound like stones shaking in a gourd. Each time it came, the boy would flinch, his grip tightening, while the girl would look at her mother's face, her expression one of clinical, heartbreaking assessment. Finally, they saw it. Not a town, not a settlement, but a scar of intention on the vast, indifferent landscape. A cabin, low and solid, crouched beside a lone, defiant cottonwood tree. A curl of smoke, pale as a sigh, rose from its stone chimney. Fences, stark and straight, carved a rectangle of order from the prairie's chaos. It was a place of permanence, of will. It was their last hope. The final 100 yards were an eternity. Mary stumbled, and this time did not catch herself. She went down in a heap of worn fabric and weary bones. The children did not cry out. They simply stopped, 2 small statues of despair, and looked toward the cabin. The door opened. A man emerged, filling the frame. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man the land itself might create, weathered, solid, and silent. He moved from the porch with an economy of motion, his boots making soft thuds in the dust. He stopped a few feet away, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked at the woman on the ground, then at the 2 children standing guard over her. His expression was unreadable, a landscape carved by sorrows of its own. The boy, Leo, stepped forward. He put himself between the man and his mother, a tiny, defiant shield. His voice, when it came, was not a child's plea but a whisper of pure, desperate negotiation. "Are you going to kill our mama?" The man's posture didn't change, but something flickered in the shadow of his hat brim. Before he could form a word, the girl, Ilara, spoke, her voice just as quiet but threaded with a terrible certainty. "She's dying." The man, Samuel, looked from the fierce little boy to the solemn little girl, and then to the woman whose shallow breaths barely stirred the dust. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain that would never fall here. He saw the ribs showing beneath the boy's patchwork coat, the raw sores on the girl's feet, the fever sheen on their mother's skin. He saw the end of a road. For a long moment, the silence stretched, pulled taut by the children's fear and his own deep, echoing emptiness. His own wife, Sarah, had looked that fragile in the end. His own son, taken by the same fever a week later, had looked that lost. The ghosts in his cabin stirred, protesting the intrusion. He had built these walls of silence to keep them in and to keep the world out. But the world had just collapsed on his doorstep. He finally knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, so as not to spook them. He ignored the boy's rigid stance and looked at the girl. "No," he said, his voice rough from disuse, like a key in a rusted lock. "I'm not." He gently reached for Mary, his hands, calloused and huge, surprisingly careful as he gathered her slight weight into his arms. She murmured something incoherent, her head falling against his chest. He stood, the burden of her feeling like a phantom limb, an ache he had forgotten how to feel. He looked at the twins. "Come on," he said, not as a command, but as a simple statement of fact. And turning his back on the unforgiving son, he carried their mother inside. He laid her on the cot in the small spare room, the one that had been Sarah's. The scent of dried lavender and cedar still clung to the quilt, a scent he usually avoided. Now, it felt like a sacrilege to bring this new suffering into the shrine of the old. He covered Mary with a heavy wool blanket, her shivering already starting despite the day's heat. The children stood huddled in the doorway, their dark eyes tracking his every move, two small wolves judging the intentions of a bear. "There's water in the bucket," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the main room. "And bread on the table." He expected them to fall on it, but they didn't move. They watched him as he stoked the fire in the main hearth, his back to them. He filled a small pot with water and set it to warm, then crumbled in some dried herbs and salted meat. A thin broth was all she could take. He worked with a familiar, practiced efficiency, the motions of survival ingrained in his hands. Every sound, the scrape of the pot, the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the bellows, was magnified in the tense silence of the cabin. He was acutely aware of the two sets of eyes on his back. They were not just watching. They were measuring, weighing, calculating their chances. He remembered that feeling. The world shrinks to the next meal, the next threat, the next safe place to sleep. When the broth was warm, he poured it into a tin cup. He turned and found them exactly where he had left them, unmoving. He held the cup out, not toward them, but toward the room where their mother lay. Leo's eyes narrowed. "Is it poison?" the boy asked, his voice low. Samuel's jaw tightened. He had not been asked a question so direct, so devoid of artifice, in 4 years. He looked down at the steaming cup in his hand, then back at the boy. He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he took a small sip of the broth himself. It was salty and thin, the taste of meager necessity. He swallowed, holding the boy's gaze. "No," he said. He walked past them into the small room. Mary's eyes were closed, her face pale and slick with sweat. He sat on the edge of the cot, the wood creaking under his weight. "Ma'am," he said softly. "Mary," he'd heard the girl whisper her name outside. "You need to drink something." He lifted her head, cradling it in the crook of his arm, and brought the cup to her lips. She coughed, a weak, wet sound, but she drank. A little dribbled down her chin, and he wiped it away with his thumb, the gesture automatic, dredged up from a part of his memory he had walled off. After a few sips, she fell back into a feverish sleep. He placed the cup on the small crate beside the bed and stood up. The twins were still in the doorway. He saw that the girl, Alara, had taken a piece of bread from the table and was breaking it in half, giving the larger piece to her brother. They ate with a slow, deliberate method, as if unsure the food was real. That night, Samuel did not sleep in his own bed. He laid his bedroll on the floor by the hearth, between the main door and the room where the family lay. He was a sentry, though he wasn't sure if he was keeping danger out or keeping himself in. He lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house he had shared only with ghosts. Now there were new sounds. The soft rustle of the children turning in their shared blanket on the floor, the ragged, shallow breathing from the spare room, the occasional fevered murmur from Mary. Each sound was a small stone dropped into the deep, still well of his solitude. He thought of Sarah's last days in that same room, her breath growing fainter until it was just gone. He thought of his son, Thomas, his small body hot with fever in the big bed, calling for a mother who couldn't answer. He had failed them. He had been strong, he had worked hard, he had prayed, but the land and the sickness had taken them anyway. After that, the silence had been his only penance. Now, this family had shattered it, and he felt a raw, unwelcome stirring in his chest. It was not kindness, not yet. It was the dull, aching pull of a responsibility he never wanted to feel again. He closed his eyes, the firelight flickering on the rough-hewn logs of the ceiling, and listened to the breathing of strangers. Days settled into a fragile, unspoken rhythm. Samuel rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime, and moved with a quietness born of living alone. He would start the fire, put on coffee, and check on Mary. Her condition was a tide, ebbing and flowing. Some mornings she was lucid, her eyes clear, though her body was weak. On those days, he would help her sip broth and she would thank him, her voice a reedy whisper. Other days, the fever held her captive, and she would toss and murmur names he didn't know. A husband named Daniel, a place called Willow Creek. He learned their story in these fevered fragments and in the children's guarded answers. Daniel had died of a lung infection a winter past. Mary's brother-in-law, Jedediah, had taken their farm, claiming a debt. He was a hard man, cruel in his drink. Mary had taken the children and fled, aiming for a distant cousin in the next territory. A foolish, desperate hope. They had been on the road for weeks. Samuel never asked for the story directly. He simply listened, his face impassive, while he went about his chores. He was a man of action, not words. His compassion was a language spoken in deeds. He found a pair of Sarah's old shoes and patiently worked the leather until it was soft, leaving them by the cot for Mary. He saw Ilara shivering one evening and laid his own heavy wool coat over the children's blankets as they slept. He noticed Leo's trousers were worn through at the knee and, one night by the fire, he patched them with a piece of stiff canvas. His large fingers clumsy with the needle but his stitches strong and sure. The twins remained his silent observers. They watched him split wood, his axe rising and falling with a powerful grace. They watched him milk his single cow, his movements gentle and sure. They watched him mend the harness for his horse, his hands knowing and capable. They never got underfoot, never made a sound, but they were always there, a pair of small, watchful shadows at the edge of his perception. The first crack in their suspicion came from Ilara. Samuel was coming back from the well, the buckets heavy in each hand. She was sitting on the porch steps, clutching a small, smooth white stone. As he passed, she held it out to him. She didn't say a word, her eyes fixed on his face. He paused, looking down at the small, offered gift. It was nothing, a simple rock, but it was an offering. He carefully set one of the buckets down, wiped his hand on his trousers, and took the stone from her. He examined it with a seriousness that honored the gesture. "It's a good one," he said, his voice quiet. He slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you." A faint, uncertain smile touched her lips before vanishing. It was the first time he had seen either of them smile. Leo remained a harder fortress to breach. The boy's distrust was a physical presence, a shield he held up against the world. He shadowed his sister, a silent protector, and his gaze on Samuel was always wary. The change came, as it often does, during the simple toil of daily work. Samuel was out by the west pasture, tamping new posts into the hard ground to replace ones that had rotted. The fence line was his bulwark against the wild, a constant battle against entropy. Leo had followed him out, keeping a safe distance, watching from the shade of the cottonwood. Samuel was stretching a length of wire, his focus on the tension, his muscles straining. He moved to the next post, securing it, and was about to move on when Leo's small voice cut through the quiet. "You missed one." Samuel stopped. He turned. Leo pointed with a thin arm. "The staple. It's loose on that post back there." Samuel walked back and checked. The boy was right. A staple had not been driven in deep enough. The wire had a slight give to it. A determined steer would have it loose in a day. He took his hammer and drove the staple home with 2 sharp, clean blows. He looked over at Leo, who was watching him, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain, as if he expected to be punished for his impertinence. Samuel gave him a slow, deliberate nod, a nod of equals, of one worker to another. "Good eye," he said. He went back to his work, and for the rest of the afternoon, the boy stayed, watching not with suspicion, but with a quiet, focused interest. That evening, as the shadows grew long and painted the prairie in hues of lavender and gold, Samuel sat on the porch, carving a piece of scrap pine. His knife moved with a practiced ease. The twins sat on the steps below, watching the shape emerge from the wood. By the time the first stars appeared, he was done. He held it out to Ilara. It was a small, simple bird, its wings half spread, as if about to take flight. She took it with a reverent slowness, her small fingers tracing its smooth lines. "What's its name?" she whispered. Samuel thought for a moment, looking at the vast, darkening sky. "Hope," he said. Leo, sitting beside his sister, leaned over to look at the bird. He didn't say anything, but he didn't pull away when Samuel's arm brushed his shoulder as the man stood up to go inside. The fortress was beginning to crumble. There came a week, a single sun-drenched week, that felt like a gift, a false spring in the autumn of their lives. Mary's fever broke. The color returned to her cheeks, and the terrible, rattling cough subsided into something less monstrous. She was able to sit up in a chair on the porch, wrapped in blankets, and watch her children play. For the first time they played. Alara, with her bird named Hope, and Leo, who had started to shadow Samuel on his chores, asking quiet, intelligent questions about the land and the animals. Laughter, a sound Samuel hadn't heard in his home for 4 years, echoed in the small cabin. It was a tentative, fragile sound, but it was real. He found himself talking more, the words coming a little easier. He told the children the name of his horse, Buck. He showed Alara the constellations in the night sky. He let Leo hold the hammer while he repaired a loose board on the porch. One afternoon, Mary watched him from her chair as he methodically split firewood. "You're a good man, Samuel," she said, her voice still weak but clear. He didn't stop his work. He set another log on the block and raised the axe. "Just doing what's needed," he grunted, bringing the axe down with a clean, satisfying crack. "No," she insisted gently. "My husband, Daniel, he was a good man too. He would have liked you. We were going to build a place just like this." He had it all planned. Her voice trailed off, lost in a memory. Samuel paused, leaning on the axe handle, his back to her. He could feel the thawing inside him, a painful, terrifying sensation, like frozen limbs coming back to life. He was beginning to care what happened to these people. He was beginning to feel the shape of a family around him again, and it scared him more than any winter storm. The dread was a constant undertone beneath the fragile peace. Mary's cough, though quieter, was never truly gone. It was a shadow in the corner of the room, a reminder of the debt that was coming due. He knew this respite was temporary. He had seen this illness before. He knew how it lied, how it offered a glimpse of sunshine before the final darkness fell. He found himself watching her, studying her, with the same grim assessment he had once seen on Alara's face, and he hated himself for it. He was starting to love these children, and he knew what was coming. The sky had been a bruised purple all day, the air thick and heavy with a silence that felt like a held breath. Then the wind came, a low moan that grew into a ravenous shriek, tearing at the cabin as if it wanted to pull the logs apart. Rain followed, not falling but thrown, hurled against the windows in horizontal sheets. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. Inside, a different storm was breaking. Mary's fever had returned with a vengeance. She lay on the cot, her body racked with chills, her breathing a ragged, desperate fight for every gasp of air. The false spring was over. The children were huddled together on a rag rug by the hearth, their faces pale in the flickering firelight, their eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the storm outside. Alara clutched her wooden bird. Leo had his arm around her, his small body a rigid line of defiance against the fear. Samuel worked with a grim, focused energy. He piled blankets on Mary, trying to fight the deep, internal cold that was consuming her. He brewed a strong, bitter tea from willow bark, forcing spoonfuls between her chattering teeth. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, not of hope, but of simple things: the warmth of the fire, the solidness of the cabin walls, the fact that she was not alone. He was a bulwark against the two tempests, the one of wind and rain raging outside, and the one of sickness and fear raging within. Is Mama going to heaven now?" Alara whispered, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. Samuel stopped what he was doing and looked at them. He saw their small, terrified faces, and the lie he wanted to tell them died on his lips. He owed them the same honesty they had given him. He walked over and knelt before them, his large frame seeming to soak up some of the fear in the room. "She is fighting," he said, his voice low and steady. "And we are here to help her fight. We stay with her. We don't leave her. That is what we do." He placed a hand on each of their heads, his touch a silent promise. Leo leaned into the touch almost imperceptibly. For the rest of the night, they were a unit, a tiny island of warmth and light against the screaming dark. Samuel tended to Mary, and when he sat, exhausted by the fire, the children would creep closer, drawing strength from his solid presence. They were bound together not by blood, but by the shared crucible of the storm. As dawn approached, the storm's fury began to wane. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and the relentless drumming of the rain softened. In the gray, watery light of the new day, exhausted and hollow-eyed, Samuel looked out the window. A figure on horseback was slowly making its way through the mud and debris toward the cabin. His body went rigid. He knew, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the morning chill, that the storm was not over. He took his rifle from its pegs above the mantel. The movement was calm, practiced. He checked the load. "Stay with your mother," he told the children, his voice flat. He walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. The rider was a big man, florid and thick-set, on a tired-looking horse. He wore a sodden coat and a look of mean-spirited triumph. He pulled up a few yards from the porch, his eyes scanning the cabin, the neat woodpile, the solid fences. It was a look of covetous appraisal. "I'm looking for my sister-in-law," the man said, his voice a gravelly bark. "Mary, and her 2 brats. Heard she came this way." "She's here," Samuel said. The rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm. "She's not well. I'll be the judge of that." The man Jedediah sneered. He made to dismount. "They're my blood, my responsibility. The law says so. They're coming with me." Samuel didn't move. He stood planted on his porch, as rooted as the old cottonwood. "The law doesn't say you can take sick folk into a storm. The law doesn't say you can take children from a safe place." Jedediah's face darkened. "Who in the hell are you to tell me about the law? You some kind of preacher? They're mine. Her husband owed me. The children can work it off." The casual cruelty of the words landed like stones in the quiet morning air. Samuel thought of Leo's thin shoulders and Alara's small, clever hands. He thought of their laughter. A cold, clean rage, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, settled over him. It was clarifying. He was no longer a man hiding from ghosts. He was a man with something to protect. He raised the rifle slightly, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. "She's sick. The children are scared. They found shelter here," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "This is their home now. They're not going with you." Jedediah stared at him, at the set of his jaw, at the stillness in his eyes, at the rifle that looked like an extension of his arm. He was a bully used to people backing down. This man was not backing down. He was a wall. Jedediah spat a wad of tobacco juice into the mud. "This ain't over," he snarled. "I'll be back. With the marshal." He wrenched his horse's head around and spurred it viciously, galloping away through the muck, a figure of impotent fury. Samuel watched him go, not lowering the rifle until he was a small speck on the horizon. He stood there for a long time, the cold metal of the gun a comfort in his hands. He had drawn a line in the mud. He had made a stand. He went back inside, his purpose clear. The confrontation with Jedediah had stripped away the last of Samuel's hesitation. He knew now what he had to do, but a ride for the doctor in town was a full day's journey, and the roads would be a quagmire of mud. He looked at Mary, her breathing a faint, shallow whisper, and he knew. There wasn't time. More than that, he sensed that a doctor was not what she needed now. She needed peace. That evening, as the last light bled from the sky, her eyes opened, and for the first time in days, they were completely clear. The fever was gone. It was the terrible, final clarity. She looked at him, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "He'll be back, won't he?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. Samuel nodded, pulling a chair close to her cot. "I won't let him take them." "I know," she said. Her gaze drifted to the doorway, where Leo and Alara were watching, their faces etched with a sorrowful understanding. "Leo, Alara, come here." They crept to her bedside. She reached out a trembling hand, and Leo took it, pressing it to his cheek. Alara laid her head on the edge of the cot, near her mother's shoulder. "You be good for Mr. Samuel," Mary whispered, her eyes finding his again over the children's heads. "He's a good man." A kind man. Her gaze held his, and in it was a desperate, silent plea that tore at the newly healed parts of his heart. "Promise me," she breathed, the words costing her almost everything. "Promise me you'll look after them. Don't let Jedediah, don't let the world." Her voice failed her. Samuel reached out and covered her hand, which was still holding Leo's. His large, calloused hand enveloped both of theirs. It was the first time he had willingly touched another person in 4 years, a conscious act of connection. He met her desperate gaze with his own steady one. "I promise, Mary," he said, his voice thick but unwavering. "I'll care for them as if they were my own. They will be safe here. This will be their home. You have my word." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The tension seemed to leave her body, a final, deep sigh of release. She had done it. She had carried her children to safety. Her work was done. She closed her eyes, her breathing growing softer, fainter. Samuel didn't move. He sat there, a silent guardian, his hand covering hers and her son's, while Alara's soft crying was the only sound in the room. He did not ride for the doctor. He stayed, honoring his first promise to this family, that she would not be alone. Mary passed just as the first rays of dawn painted the storm-washed sky in pale shades of rose and gray. It was a peaceful end, a quiet slipping away. The grief in the small cabin was immense, but it was a quiet, heavy thing. Not a storm but a deep, still ocean. Samuel held the children, one under each arm, their small, shaking bodies pressed against his solid frame, and let them cry until their tears were spent. He moved through the next few days with a gentle, solemn purpose. He found smooth, straight-grained pine boards he had been saving and, with careful, loving hands, built a simple, sturdy coffin. He dug a grave himself, on the small rise behind the cabin, beneath the branches of the lone cottonwood tree. The spot overlooked the whole ranch, the rolling prairie stretching out to the horizon. It was a good place to rest. Leo and Alara helped. They seemed to understand that this work was a final act of love. They sanded the corners of the coffin until they were smooth. They gathered armfuls of wild prairie flowers, purple asters and yellow goldenrod, and lined the grave with them. When it was time, Samuel carried Mary, wrapped in her finest quilt, and laid her to rest. There were no prayers from a book, only the words he spoke into the quiet air. "She was a good mother," he said, his voice rough. "She was brave. She loved you very much. We won't forget her." He filled the grave, the soft thud of the earth a final, somber punctuation. Afterward, they stood there for a long time, the three of them, a strange new constellation under the vast open sky. Just as Jedediah had threatened, the town marshal arrived 2 days later. He was a lean, weary-looking man with kind eyes. Jedediah was with him, looking smug. The marshal listened patiently, first to Jedediah's blustering claims of kinship and property, then to Samuel's quiet, factual account. He looked at the new grave under the tree. He looked at the clean cabin, the patched clothes on the children, the healthy sheen on their hair. He looked at the way Alara held onto Samuel's pant leg, and the way Leo stood beside him, mimicking his stance. "Jedediah," the marshal said finally, his voice tired, "this woman walked 50 miles to get away from you. These children look cared for. You look like you've been in a saloon for a week. The children stay with Mr. Samuel here. It's what their mother wanted. We'll get the paperwork done in town. Now get off this land before I arrest you for harassment." Jedediah's face turned a blotchy red, but he saw the finality in the marshal's eyes. He spat on the ground, turned, and left without another word. The threat was gone. The seasons turned. Summer's heat gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The ranch was the same, but it was also profoundly different. It was no longer a place of silence and memory. It was a home, filled with the small sounds of life, the clatter of a dropped spoon, the murmur of a story being read by the fire, the sound of laughter chasing chickens in the yard. Samuel was different. The deep lines of grief on his face had softened. His eyes, once haunted, were now clear and present. He was no longer just surviving, he was living. He taught Leo how to read the clouds for weather and how to track a rabbit. He taught Alara how to knead bread and how to tell which plants were medicine and which were poison. In turn, they taught him how to laugh again, how to see the world not as a place of loss, but as a place of small daily wonders. One bright spring morning, a year after they had first arrived, the three of them were up on the rise by the cottonwood tree. The prairie was bursting with new life, a carpet of green dotted with wildflowers. Samuel had made a simple wooden cross to mark Mary's grave. Alara knelt beside it, carefully pressing small seeds into the soil she had tilled with a trowel. "Mama liked sunflowers," she said, patting the earth down. "She said they always turn to face the light." Samuel stood beside Leo, watching her. He was showing the boy how to properly splice a rope. "You see," he said, his large hands guiding Leo's smaller ones. "You weave the strands together, one over the other. It makes it stronger than it was before." Leo nodded, his face serious with concentration as he copied the motion. "Stronger together," he repeated, not as a question, but as a fact he now understood. Samuel looked from the boy's determined face to the girl planting seeds of hope, to the grave of the woman who had brought them to him. He looked out at the vast expanse of his land, the fences he maintained, the cabin that was now a home. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was a good life, a shared life. The ghosts of Sarah and Thomas were still there, but they were no longer specters of grief. They were gentle memories, part of the fabric of the place, woven together with the new, bright threads of Leo and Alara. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. "Yes," Samuel said, his voice full of a quiet, hard-won peace. "Stronger together." The sun warmed their backs, and a gentle breeze rustled the new leaves on the cottonwood tree, whispering promises of the seasons to come.